Welcome to another class of the online course Organizing in Times of Crisis. My name is Nora Lohmeyer. I'm Assistant Professor of Organizational Design and Development at Radboud University in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. I do research on the politics around corporate social responsibility and labor standards in global supply chains. The following video is devoted to the topic of corporate social responsibility, or short CSR, with one focus on the relationship of businesses to their stakeholders. I'm sure you have come across the term CSR or one of its variants such as corporate sustainability or stakeholder management. But so far you might not have thought much about what this notion means in the context of armed conflicts and war, such as the current invasion of Russia into the Ukraine. So with this video, let me invite you to reflect on the question what CSR might mean in times of war, as well as how stakeholder relationships are affected and potentially reconfigured in times of crisis. In the assignment belonging to this video, you will reflect on these questions. I have selected readings that will help you with that. This video will provide you with the necessary conceptual basis for your reflections. First, it will provide you with a basic understanding of what CSR is about. And second, it will allow you to understand the stakeholder approach and its relation to the shareholder approach to the firm. Environmental destruction, child labor and poor working conditions, corruption, rising social inequality, climate change. These are some of the grand challenges societies are facing today. Armed conflicts such as the current one constitute yet another crisis, adding new challenges and contributing to some of the aforementioned crises. Companies and their daily business practices play a huge role in all of these crises. This is where corporate social responsibility comes into play. CSR is about the question how companies can contribute to addressing these or other crises. Or more broadly, how can they take responsibility for their social, environmental, and economic impacts. It is about how firms can avoid harming others. For instance, how can they prevent contributing to climate change, environmental destruction, or human suffering in times of war. And it is about how firms can contribute positively to society through good business practices. For instance, how can they provide fair working conditions, develop sustainable innovations that help mitigating the climate crisis, or how can they contribute to political sanctions against aggressors in armed conflicts? CSR is thus more than complying to law or managing a firm's reputation. It rather comprises actions that appear to further some social or environmental good that go beyond what is required by law and what lies in the immediate interest of the firm. This then also implies that CSR is far more than just how firms spend their profits, for instance in the form of donations or charitable organizations. More importantly, it is about how firms make their profits, how they conduct their daily business. This also implies that if we take the notion of CSR seriously, we look at business organizations as far more than just economic actors. They are seen as political and even moral actors as well, because with the notion of CSR, we take account of not only their economic impacts, but their societal, political, and environmental impacts as well. If CSR is about how businesses do their daily business, how then can they engage in CSR? There are many ways through which business organizations can engage in CSR. Usually, CSR is considered to have three pillars: economic responsibility, environmental responsibility, and social responsibility. Each of these pillars can comprise a variety of different practices. Those listed here are only a short selection of examples. Engaging in economic responsibility, for instance, might comprise working against corruption or promoting fair competition and transparency. Engaging in environmental responsibility might comprise having policies and practices in place around waste reduction or the preservation of biodiversity. Social responsibility can subsume policies and practices around fair wages, health and safety for employees, or providing equal opportunity. While it would be, of course, desirable for organizations to be responsible in all of their business practices, in practice, the areas organizations engage in will differ per country, industry, and/or organization. Also, looking at the multitude of areas in which organization can act more or less responsibly, it would appear to be misguided to speak of the responsible organization. Rather, we are likely to witness organizations with different constellations of more or less responsible business practices across these different areas. Organizations can act responsible in some areas and at the same time irresponsible in others. And levels of responsibility and irresponsibility are likely to change over time. How and why then do organizations become more responsible? Answering this question could, of course, fill an entire lecture series. Broadly speaking, we can differentiate between internal and external drivers or infrastructures that contribute to businesses becoming more responsible. CSR is thus not only a question of individual behavior within an organization, such as, for instance, ethical leaders supporting their employees to act according to what is the right thing to do, or morally committed employees. Even more so, it requires organizational structures and rules, such as responsibility-oriented guidelines or incentive systems. All of these can be driven by various motives, such as instrumental motives directed at the increase in financial performance or organizational reputation, relational motives oriented towards stakeholder relations and a social license to operate, or moral motives guided by principles of, for instance, equality or justice. However, you can well imagine that given the competitive pressure exerted by capitalist market economies, these intra-organizational efforts might not be enough to drive organizations towards more responsibility. As long as organizations remain embedded in competitive markets, they are likely to cease CSR efforts in economically difficult times. CSR therefore also requires inter-organizational contestation and the right institutional frameworks. That is, firms need to be pushed towards more responsible practices by various external drivers or conditions. And these might involve the following: state regulations such as rules and laws or sanctions. Think of environmental or labor laws, for instance. These, however, are limited in global contexts such as global supply chains because traditional state regulation most often is applicable only within national boundaries. We can therefore also think about transnational collaboration between governments, such as in trade agreements or transnational organizations. Civil society actors also form an important part of the institutional framework around CSR. Here, for instance, non-governmental organizations take the role of watchdogs or put pressure on firms through various campaigns. Unions engage in negotiations around decent working conditions, or these actors engage in the development and implementation of business standards. But also businesses themselves engage in various forms of governance, also referred to as business self-regulation. Here, businesses set rules for themselves or jointly develop and implement industry standards and guidelines. Such forms of private regulation, both by civil society actors as well as business actors, have become increasingly important in recent decades, given that they are able to transcend national borders and are considered to be more flexible. However, we also see a continued importance of state regulation as well as national-level institutionalized norms regarding appropriate corporate behavior. I'm sure it has become evident by now that CSR is concerned with the business-society relationship. We have heard that it is about firms accounting for the broader economic, environmental, and social impacts, thus the impact businesses have on society. On the other hand, and if we think about various societal actors engaging in the responsibilization of corporations, as we have seen in the previous slides, we can also easily understand that CSR is also about the impact societal actors have on businesses. On a more concrete level, we can conceptualize this business-society relationship as every firm influencing and being influenced by various social groups or stakeholders. The notion of stakeholders are usually considered as those actors that are affected or can affect the achievement of an organization's object. Think of actors such as the owners or shareholders, an organization's employees, suppliers, consumers, but also NGOs and unions, governments, as well as the communities firms are operating in. Businesses often work together with these groups or contribute to their well-being through the provision of products or services or by providing employment. In such moments, the interest of businesses and their stakeholders might be aligned. However, in the context of CSR, we are first and foremost concerned with those moments where the interests of businesses stand in conflict with those of society or various stakeholder groups. Those moments, for instance, where business practices harm the environment, contribute to climate change, or poor working conditions. Organization and management scholars have long been concerned with the question of how such conflicts can be resolved and have suggested different approaches to conceptualizing the business-society relationship. The most prominent approach to thinking about this relationship is the shareholder view of the firm. According to the shareholder view, businesses deal with the complexity of business-society conflicts by focusing on the interest of one stakeholder group alone, the owners or the shareholders. According to one of the key voices in this debate, economist Milton Friedman, business have one and only one social responsibility: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits, so long as it stays within the rules of the game. Firms have therefore solely responsibility towards their shareholders. Maximizing shareholder value from this perspective could then be considered as one form of CSR, with other forms of corporate responsibility being denied or ignored. The shareholder view thus presents a reductionist view on the business-society relationship. Corporations are first and foremost economic actors and serve the economic interest of their shareholders, rather than taking other societal actors into account. It is clear that the shareholder approach to the firm is limited in various ways. Main points of critique include that its sole focus on profit maximization promotes short-term thinking and action and orientation towards purely economic and measurable success criteria. It has also been criticized that it presents a rather isolated view on the firm, for instance ignoring negative externalities and complexities of firms' effects on other areas than the economy. Furthermore, with its assumption of firms operating within the realm of the law, it has been said to follow a rather naive understanding of firms' compliance to the law. For instance, it is blind to the fact that laws are not made by neutral actors, but that businesses often have a huge influence on what and how laws are developed. Lastly, with its focus on shareholders as the single relevant stakeholder group, it obviously neglects other potentially relevant stakeholder groups and their interests. Given this critique, an alternative approach to conceptualizing the business-society relationship was developed, the stakeholder view of the firm. The stakeholder view sought to take the firm's embeddedness in society as well as various stakeholder relationships more serious. Promoters of this view have highlighted that firms are required to act in the best interest of a variety of stakeholders instead of just for shareholders. From this view, then, managers' tasks involve not just maximizing profits for shareholders, but managing a variety of relationships to other stakeholder groups as well. Here, a socially responsible firm requires simultaneous attention to the legitimate interest of a multiplicity of interests from various groups. Especially in relation to the shareholder view of the firm, you will see that the stakeholder approach conceptualizes the business-society relationship in a more encompassive, inclusive fashion. However, has also been said to have difficulties when it and when accounting for the conflicts in this relationship, for instance, conflicts between businesses and stakeholder interests or the interests of different stakeholder groups. Such conflicts are usually approached by keeping firm financial interests the dominant guide for corporate decision-making. First, most approaches to stakeholder theory continue to see stakeholders as being relevant only to the extent that they contribute to business financial performance. Second, and relatedly, where decisions need to be made between different stakeholder groups, supporters of this theory suggest to focus on those groups that are most powerful and have the ability to threaten firm performance. That is, those stakeholders are likely to be prioritized that are most powerful and closest to the organization. Those without powers to directly affect firms, which are often those suffering the most from corporate conduct, do not come high on the corporate agenda. The move from shareholder orientation to stakeholder orientation is certainly a fundamental one. However, it merits to ask in how far the stakeholder approach to the firm, or at least its most common variants, really differs from the doctrine of shareholder prioritization. As Barnett concludes, although they are commonly depicted as diametrically opposed, the shareholder and stakeholder perspectives both seek to maximize the profitability of the firm and differ only in the path prescribed to do so. He goes on to argue that neither perspective is concerned with alleviating the broader ills of society. The stakeholder discussion, thus, is a good example to understand that most approaches within the broader CSR debate fail, or at least are limited to account for the complexities of the business-society relationship. While the stakeholder debate makes an attempt to take this relationship more serious, it remains within the dominant market logic also underlying the shareholder view, and that it continues to treat stakeholders as a means to a financial end. This continued dominance of business interests over societal interest is what has led to an increasing skepticism around the notion of CSR. On a very basic level, scholars have argued that the ongoing corporate misconduct and the aggravation of the various crises mentioned in the beginning of this video are testament of the failure of companies' CSR practices to mitigate these crises. Among critics of CSR, there is thus a growing concern that CSR is largely ineffective. First, this ineffectiveness is seen as being grounded in CSR trying to solve the macro-systemic problem of capitalism by changing micro-firm level behaviors, as Crane and colleagues have argued. As we have discussed before, many CSR approaches fail or are limited in tackling the conflicts between business and society created by capitalism. They seek to tackle these problems with the same logic that has contributed to these problems in the first place. As Crane and colleagues put it, they seek to rethink the purpose of the corporation without questioning the sanctity of corporate self-interest itself. Relatedly, fundamental skepticism towards the notion of CSR has come from researchers looking at the historical emergence of CSR, showing that the emergence of the notion of CSR in the US, the UK, and parts of Europe was shaped to accompany the dismantling of existing forms of institutionalized corporate responsibility and corporatist regulation. The emergence of CSR is thus intricately linked with business movements towards deregulation and the privatization of regulation. Against this background, the increasing engagement of businesses in forms of private regulation and the provision of public goods in the realm of voluntary CSR programs, there needs to be seen not only as a firm taking up responsibility, but also an increase in corporate political power and an expansion of private action in the public domain. Given these points of criticism, CSR has been seen as a form of capitalist indoctrination or ethical sealing of corporate irresponsibility. By providing an ethical seal to the negative effects of capitalism, CSR can shield capitalism from criticism and promote businesses as usual. As Schneider argues, from this viewpoint, CSR can be understood as one of the channels through which neoliberal ideology is reproduced, with this resulting in a legitimization of problematic business practices. Many of these critics of CSR consider CSR as a promising notion to advance corporate responsibility and accountability, and to think about ways to hold businesses accountable. However, they suggest that some form of caution is warranted when it comes to the current use of this term. We are coming to an end of this video. Before we close, I would like to invite you to reflect on what CSR and stakeholder relations mean in times of war. What could CSR look like in the realm of the current armed conflict? For businesses, the current crisis presents immediate challenges. These range from protecting workers in the affected regions, to supply chain disruptions, to spikes in energy prices. But it also raises bigger questions on what it means for companies to support democracy, human rights, or the rule of law. Likewise, we can ask, how are stakeholder relationships affected in light of the current crisis? Certainly, the current armed conflict has led to stakeholder priorities being reconsidered. Think of businesses having operations and thus being involved in various stakeholder relationships in the countries involved in this conflict. Global businesses might have customers, investors, suppliers, or business partners in both of these countries or their various allies. The conflict then likely leads to a reconsideration of stakeholder priorities. Many businesses have reacted in some form or another to the Russian invasion in the Ukraine, many of them only after severe pressures from their stakeholders. The Yale School of Management has collected different responses of corporations. You can see a variety of reactions to the war, ranging from a continuation of business as usual to complete withdrawal from Russia, with firms shutting down business operations, stopping sales or suspending services in Russia, some of them continuing payment to their employees. Other actions involved businesses offering specific services or products to Ukrainian people for free or for reduced prices, or adapting their services and products to current needs of Ukrainian refugees or those staying within the country. At times, this also included financial support or in-kind contributions of goods and services for in-country employees and their relatives, as well as to humanitarian aid organizations. Transnational organizations as well have become engaged with the question what corporations can do to alleviate the suffering of Ukrainian people, as well as to take position in the conflict. The United Nations Global Compact, for instance, has issued a guidance for businesses for how to respond to the Ukraine's humanitarian crisis. In the assignment, I invite you to reflect on the actions taken by some of the firms. How can these actions be understood in light of what we discussed in this video? For instance, how can we make sense of these actions in light of the shareholder versus stakeholder view of the firm? Do we witness a turn away from the shareholder doctrine? Let me close by thanking you for your attention. I hope this video clip got you interested in CSR and stakeholder relations more generally, and their changing meanings in times of war in particular.